But let me just say a little bit about my background. So I am the son of a psychiatrist and a special needs teacher from the north of Scotland. We lived on the site of a local psychiatric hospital for the first 10 years of my life. And that was my community. I didn't know any other community. That was my family home. And I felt very at home in the whole hospital environment. And we were made as our family to feel very much part of it. It became obvious to me that where I lived and the family, people I called my family, were not quite viewed the same way by our other local residents. And when I invited friends to come back to my house and we would stare from the bottom of a long drive, didn't they always have long driveways? And they would say, "You live up there?" And I say, "Yeah, it's great, come on in." So it struck me that the world and that I took to be as my world and my normal world was not the same for other people. And those early experiences have never left me. But I have moved more away from mental health services, although my heart's still very much there, and began to float upstream as I began to see that no matter what we were trying to do in service land, it really didn't make much of a difference to the core aspects of people's lives. And however hard we tried, however much investment we were making, we still weren't really improving people's lives. And there was a wonderful phrase from a book in America in the 1990s describing the American psychiatric system and the lives for people. It was better, but not well. So I started floating upstream to find out what was going on, and I've never really stopped that journey. So as I'm continually floating upstream, let me share some reflections with you. Can I have the next slide, please? This is what I'm going to try and go through, and someone please give me a time check at 20 minutes. I'm going to just outline some reflections on mental health policy over the last 20 years, give you some upfront observations of what I'm seeing and what I'm thinking about what's happening, why now, and the evidence for what you do in the work that you do on mental health promotion, and the promotion of mental well-being is so important, some international examples, what we're learning, and just some reflections on what might help. Okay, so let's go. Next slide, please. So if I think about national mental health developments, please don't read too much into the slides. This is me giving myself a nice guide, but there have been, to my mind, 3 phases over the last 20 years in terms of mental health policy. The first phase was almost universally focused on services, moving things into community services, community teams, crisis response. Remember, a lot of this had been going on since the late 50s, early 60s. Primary care, mental health care was emerging a little bit, but the focus was on mental illness treatment. It was clinically led and typically top down. We then moved into a phase around the 80s and 90s, which had much more of a recovery orientation, advanced and progressed by many wonderful recovery leaders from across the world, particularly from North America and Canada. Lived experience informed, trauma informed, more culturally informed, and had a lot more emphasis on a rights base. Psychological services for anxiety and depression beginning to emerge. New mental health acts, for example, the one in Scotland, were looking at reciprocity. If they take away someone's freedom, they promise to give something back in return. Much wider service system, health, social care, a little bit of education, much more into employment. There was a broader coalition and a really important rights focus. But that's moved on again since then. And we're now in what I would call a phase 3 with government and international mental health policies. We're looking at mental health strategies, a much wider focus, illness and wellness, and the balance and or tensions between the two. Much more use of the phraseology mental well-being, because somehow mental health isn't cutting it in terms of the upstream language people want to see. Much more focus on social determinants, many more players getting involved, a large narrative around jobs, homes, friends, big mix of stakeholders, looking at others, whether it's education, criminal justice, much more complexity, moving out of the health domain and visibly moving upstream into what you and I would call promotion and prevention. Next slide, please. Now, whilst all of that is wonderful and welcome, and listen, it doesn't happen necessarily sequentially, and we sometimes dip back through the phases. There are places that you'll recognize are probably still working on phase 1, some on phase 2, and there have been challenges everywhere. But let me just give some observations. So isn't it great that governments are increasingly committed to a broader vision for mental health? That's fantastic. And as I'll say later, governments don't always really land well on prevention. We hear many times prevention is better than cure, but when you're working in 3, 4, and 5-year political cycles, there may not be the return on benefits by going into prevention land. So we get a lot of really nice, encouraging words, which I don't want to decry because they authorize the behaviors we want to see. But the funding invariably defaults to mental health services. It certainly does in the jurisdictions I've got experience of working in most. And that's a political and what we call our treasury in the UK, but your finance ministers. And that bias is around, policy. The second one is ministries of health are also committed, as well as governments, to a broader vision for mental health. But again, their funding invariably defaults to services. And that's part of the political culture of being in a health department and problems of cross-departmental working and cross-government working. In the jurisdictions that I've worked in, I find it sometimes quite disappointing that ministries aren't awarded for cross-agency or cross-departmental working. Everyone agrees that good mental health is a desirable goal, mental well-being for all, but most people still hear mental health and equate that with illness and as a problem, which is the role of the health services to fix. And those are culture and public perception problems. So we need to ask ourselves, do any of these observations make sense? And if they do, what can we do to change the narrative and shift those observations? Next set of observations, please. Next slide. Sorry. Yeah, thank you. So government departments want health money and they want investment for mental health interventions, but that's challenging. The mental health system is a difficult one to understand and navigate for non-mental health people, and that allows the expert pathology system leaders to take more of the control. And professional expertise, in my experience, is more highly valued at government level than lived experience and community experience, and professional advocacy still dominates in the corridors of power. And mental health is seen as a problem to fix, not a desirable goal in itself. And it's easier to focus on services than it is the drivers of poor mental health. Next slide, please. So on the upside, mental health professionals are now more positively disposed to prevention and promotion. In the UK, the recent person who's been voted in as the leader of the Royal College of Psychiatrists, Dr. Laddie Smith, is a very pro-social determinants, pro-promotion and prevention leader. Other government departments are insufficiently incentivized to the pursuit of mental health outcomes. And for those of us who are working with and for people with severe and enduring mental illness, their whole of life needs are mostly invisible in other government department policies, whether that's welfare, housing, employment, or education. And it still strikes me that the mental health of societies most vulnerable is insufficiently prioritized. And does our focus on mental well-being help that or exacerbate it? Next slide, please. Why now? Well, we're emerging from COVID. That's shown the importance of communities, neighborhoods, tackling the social determinants, growing gaps in inequalities, and the effects that COVID has had on the most vulnerable and marginalized, and the huge swathes of racial injustice that we've seen across the world in relation to the response to COVID. The evidence for promotion and prevention is growing and getting stronger. And there are many good examples from research and practice, and thankfully many agencies now investing in research and promotion and prevention. And your Public Health Agency of Canada needs to be congratulated for its investment in research and practice. The investment in upstream prevention is happening, but let's be honest, it's slow and smaller scale, but the return on investment is hugely beneficial. A recent study from the UK Health Foundation showed that for every dollar spent, you get a 3 times return downstream for your investments in promotion and prevention. So we can make the evidence argument, we can make the funding and investment argument, but can we make the policy, practice, and impact argument? Next slide, please. Well, what helps? Well, the evidence helps. And these are some examples from a recent meta-analysis done by colleagues in Galway University. And these are some of the things that you all know. And I was looking at some of the projects that you're funding through the FAC initiatives, both the COVID initiative and your mental health promotion initiatives. And you're funding all the right things that have the evidence. But it is interesting, we know the evidence of what works in early years, for schools, for communities. Next slide, please. We know for primary care, and we're looking now at digital. Okay, it may be a lot of digital is CBT online, so we're transferring what we normally do in the traditional system to an online environment. That was hugely beneficial during COVID. But there are a range of other platforms, particularly peer support platforms, that provide 24/7 support whenever you want, wherever you want, for communities right across the globe. And you in Canada have examples of these peer support platforms, and they provide this asynchronous support when you need it, when you want it, no waiting times, absolutely immediate wraparound support. And we see a number of governments like yours making investments in a range of areas for which we need to be grateful, but also asking more from. Next slide, please. That's the reference for the evidence impact. The organizers will share my slides, so you'll be able to get that. It's done by colleagues in the University of Galway in Ireland, and it'll be available soon. It was commissioned by the Irish government, but that will be available soon. Very, very impactful synthesis of the impact and the evidence. Next slide, please. So here's some country examples. Let's start with the first country, New Zealand. Well, New Zealand has this amazing written policy. If you haven't seen it, it's a long, large policy document, and it goes by the Maori name of Kia Mana Wanui. And it's a long-term pathway to mental well-being. It brings with it $1.9 billion of investment from the New Zealand government. Now, $1.9 billion, you can do the maths, it's probably equivalent to 1.9 Canadian dollars, 1.9 billion Canadian dollars. That is a cross-government investment. It's got a hugely warm welcome to its bicultural approach, with huge emphasis on the Maori and Pacific Island communities. And it is part of wider government action on well-being. Many of you will probably be aware that Jacinda Ardern and the New Zealand government have a well-being policy that's meant to drive the Treasury investment of policies in that part of the world. Next slide, please. So how's it going? Well, the investment is welcome, but when we look at where the investment has gone and is going, the vast majority is still going on services. But that's not to say that of a proportion higher than other countries, I would argue. In the UK, we had a 500 million investment over COVID, and something like 15 million came to the prevention and promotion agenda. So I think New Zealand, while the vast majority of funding is going into services, still a larger proportion of that than other jurisdictions is going to promotion and prevention. There is a current transition to a new health system in New Zealand. Don't those things always get in the way? But that is impeding the operation and impact of the policy. It has a very welcome focus on primary care, with local community health approaches being invested in, where people are coming into the general practice hubs, they're getting seen, but they're also being able to go to someone like a community navigator, a community organizer, that will put the most simple and effective psychosocial interventions in place to improve that person's recovery or to improve their ability to deal with the health challenges they face. It has a very promising bicultural focus, and the well-being overview is still incredibly important, that this policy on mental well-being is part of a wider, more overarching cabinet-led policy. Next slide, please. In Scotland, they have a very comprehensive and integrated policies for mental health that include everything from the promotion of mental health and well-being right through to services, forensic services, and their Mental Health Act. So if you like a policy document, please Google the Scottish Government mental health pages on their website. It does make a very comprehensive and integrated read. They're doing a consultation on a new strategy, a longer term strategy, and they're looking within that at the reasons behind poor mental health, creating the conditions both individually and collectively for people to thrive in communities, challenging stigma, and also where necessary, providing specialist help. Next slide. Well, how's that going? Impressive range of interrelated policies. Measurement is a key focus in Scotland, and they have a key indicators framework that includes a whole battery of measures and indicators on mental well-being. And one of those indicators, the Warwick-Edinburgh Mental Wellbeing Scale, is still one of the top 21 national performance indicators for how Scotland is doing. So if you have a measurement that you feel is effective in measuring the mental well-being of your country and jurisdiction, please fight and work as hard as you can to get those measures into national indicators. They have a very interesting focus on brief interventions, what they call their distress brief intervention program, which is for anyone feeling in mental distress momentarily to get in touch with a service locally that will provide a psychosocial and non-clinical response. Very community orientated, very community-based, very community-led. There will be a response within 24 hours, 48 hours holding, and if necessary, up to 2 weeks of interventions through this DBI program. They're strong on digital, although admittedly, wave one more about putting talking therapies and face-to-face online. The question still to remain as to whether the cross-government buy-in will continue and will emerge more fully from the consultation process. Next slide, please. Let's move south of the border to England. Impressive amount of cross-government work over COVID, very impressive COVID-19 mental health recovery plan, cabinet driven, had some money, cross-departmental commitments and shared responsibility with some short-term investment upstream. And again, they've consulted widely on a 10-year mental health strategy with cross-government ambitions for mental well-being. Next slide. Unfortunately, this is not going so well. They have totally lost momentum in cross-government work. Upstream investment is all but gone. Now it's all about health services rather than health. And even the leader of the opposition in England or the UK, Keir Starmer, said one of his 5 promises is to make the health services and NHS better. No talk about wider health, community health, orientation towards a more salutogenic approach to health. And there is no long-term mental health strategy. It's to be replaced by a 6-condition strategy. Admittedly, that includes mental illness and dementia, but that takes us right back into conditions and services. So sometimes you can see gains are made only to be lost with a change in leadership, change in government, or a change in public policy emphasis. Next slide, please. Ireland, a strong range of mental health policies. Again, a recent government focus on well-being and community well-being, led by the Taoiseach, the Prime Minister, begun to embed mental health promotion in cross-government work, very strong in education and young people, and they've established a national mental health promotion steering group being guided by the evidence produced by Professor Margaret Barry and her colleagues in Galway. Next slide. How's that going? Well, the well-being focus nationally is at an early stage, but it's part of something bigger. Mental health promotion will be hopefully part of this focus. Investment is still strongest in services, and there's a bit of a confusion of who owns promotion because the health service executive produced a very good document called Sharing the Vision, talking about mental health promotion. So who owns promotion? Does it come from services or does it come from the wider mental well-being public health field? Very strong community-focused actions, an encouraging range of projects. And the one thing about Ireland, which I think you also have in Canada, is there's been a very good level of investment and a good level of mental health promotion or public mental health expertise. Next slide, please. Singapore, they have a very interesting, more practically based model. based on community neighborhood hubs, wellness hubs in local neighborhoods with integrated services and supports, supporting families and individuals, providing a range of integrated psychosocial services, support, screening, early intervention, information, and onward referral. Bereavement, relationship support, family support, caregiver support. You can see here a very integrated hub. Obviously a very urban city. Again, population similar to, Singapore, population of 4 or 5 million, Scotland, a population of 5 million, Ireland between 4 and 5 million, New Zealand, 5 million, something about that magic 4 to 5 million that seems to make it easier to get things done. How's it going in Singapore? Next slide. Well, strong focus on neighborhoods, integrating mental health and mental well-being in community hubs, good public awareness and social marketing, really interesting marketing, social marketing, high levels of interest and digital technologies. Mental health services still dominate, but they've got a unit of innovation inside the health department dedicated to driving a whole of health approach. Very impressive. Next slide, please. Challenges and opportunities. Let's see what some of the challenges are. This was a quote from a colleague of mine called Lynn Friedley back in 2009, when we were doing work for WHO on mental health, resilience, and inequalities. I can't believe it's nearly, gosh, 20, you do the maths, but it's a long time ago. Even then, levels of mental distress amongst communities need to be understood less in terms of individual pathology and more as a response to poverty, deprivation, and social injustice. These are the things that erode the emotional, spiritual, and intellectual resources essential to our psychological well-being. I think what Lynn said in 2009 still has a huge resonance for me, or maybe I've just been spending a little bit too much time on UK policies, but I don't know, maybe it speaks to you too. Next slide, please. I've just had the 20-minute warning, so thank you, Annette. This is something that a great sociologist called Zygmunt Bauman said in 2007, not in response to Lynn, but on the same vein. And I just wonder if some of this still sticks in some of our policy making and gives us the kind of impetus we need to challenge some of the policy paradigms that we see in front of us. Although the risks and contradictions of life go on being as socially produced than ever, the duty and necessity of coping them has been delegated to our individual selves. One of the things that I love most about the promotion and prevention agenda and the work that you do and people like you do is that whole of community, is that whole emphasis on structural and social determinants and not letting ourselves be hoodwinked or somehow the wool pulled over our eyes that individually exhorting individuals to do better is going to make a significant difference. We have to be working at individual, community, policy, and structural levels at every single one time. We know that. Next slide, please. What you do is needed now more than ever. You carry the banner for that more integrated upstream whole of life approach, focusing on the wider determinants, working in, for, and with communities. And you seek to understand and combat the structural determinants and the injustice that happens and promoting the rights of Indigenous peoples. So the urgency of what you and others do couldn't be more urgently stated. Next slide, please. One of the things that we are though facing is an uphill battle in convincing our governments to be more preventative. And this is a recent book, or more like a kind of pamphlet, by Paul Kearney and his colleague Emily St. Denny in the UK. And it's a very interesting read. It looks at different examples from public health. It looks at the example of tobacco, but the take home is in short burst timelines of 3, 4, and 5 years for governments, it's not any wonder that they don't focus on longer term objectives. But when we push the politicians in different political parties to take a longer term vision and give them the courage and the evidence with which to make these bold steps, we and the work that you do are some of the people that give them that courage to go more upstream, invest more in prevention, and see the longer term investment. And if governments and politicians don't have that longer term vision, part of our job and responsibility is to show people why that is possible, how that can be, and the gains that can be made, and to make their political choices based on that evidence and knowledge. Next slide, please. Sometimes having a framework to guide your actions help. Next slide, please. And this is a framework that I've found helpful. If you look at the internal side and the external side, the internal is what we feel is internal to ourselves. The external side is those things like services, like systems, like the culture and political context. And this is an integral vision, and it's helped guide some of the work that myself and others have done. Because if you go too much on the internal, you can get lost. Too much on the external, you can lose the connection with yourself and also with communities. So the trick here is to try and make sure that you are pursuing a line in every single one of these quadrants and keeping those lines equal. So you're paying attention to the individual, you're paying attention to the collective and what that means for our internal world and our internal sense of self and working, and the external world at the same time, influencing and changing services and systems, be it health, be it education, but also influencing and advocating for the cultural and political context to be open and ready and aware with what we need for the evidence for mental well-being. So it can be a helpful framework. And finally, my last slide. What can help? Well, this is it's hard. The work that you do is hard. And you need sustenance. And you get that sustenance by sharing your experiences and learning together. And symposiums and hubs like this are your community of practice. And working on your narrative, creating that sense of urgency from your practice, from your experience, from the voices of those that you're working with. And creating the forums with and through others to share your experiencing views and ideas, going beyond health, working with your allies, that wider coalition of interests, and being part of a wider change, whatever that is, whether it's well-being, the environment, sustainable growth, and lastly, really understanding the political framework. My last slide. What we do is hard, but it's emerging. We are all disruptors in the mental health space, and that can sometimes agitate some colleagues in other parts of the mental health ecosystem. But if we can do that in a respectful and a kind way, not everyone will get what we say, but we do what we do with the humility and knowledge that we are doing this based on our own, our families, and our community's lived experience. And we need each other. And from my fortunate position to be able to go to different jurisdictions around the world, there is a huge global family and community out there who we can learn from, be inspired by, and learn and make that impact that we all want to make together. Thank you very much.